For today's episode, this is our last episode of season 10. Super excited to chat with Roger today about 5 games that taught us something from 2020. So, do keep in mind, these are very much games that taught us something. So, it's not necessarily content related or skills related, though we do cover some games that have to do with content and skill based learning. They're just kind of games that we played this year that we really learned from and we really appreciated playing this year. With that, before we get into the episode, make sure you are a part of our email community. You can find that at boardgamingwitheducation.com. It's about the second thing on the page there. So be sure to sign up and you'll have access to different resources as well as news articles and other things happening in game-based learning, gamification, and board games for learning. And in our email newsletter, you'll pretty much know everything going on with Board Game with Education. All right, let's get to the show.
Board Gaming with Education, a podcast for anyone curious about how games and education mix. We explore various topics like game-based learning, gamification, and board games, and the impacts they have on learning. Here's your host, Dustin Stats.
So welcome to another episode of Board Game with Education. Today, we are talking about our top games that taught us something in 2020. I'm joined with Roger. Roger, welcome back to the show.
Yep, thanks for having me again, Dustin.
So we're going to chat about some games, and we're going to talk about the games that taught us something this year. I think we were chatting before we started recording that this year's been a bit different for both of us. I was looking at mine. I don't know, maybe this year for me, it's been pretty average because I'm fairly new into like the board game hobby and keeping track of my games. See, in 2018, I got the board game app towards the end of the year. So I had 9 new games. 2019, I had 80 new games. And this year, I had 53 new games that I've played. Um, so I guess a little bit down, but you mentioned you had 93 new games this year.
That's way down from what I'm normally. I'd say I've been tracking mine since 2015, and I was probably averaging, 140 to 150 new ones every year. So, but it's understandable.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to.
I mean, you could have played some new, and as the year progressed, I went a lot of digital stuff, and I got a lot of new plays in that way. So, whether we want to count that, but it counts to me.
Yeah, and that's something I was thinking about too. Is I've done some digital games that I haven't logged. We've been doing a Mothership RPG, King's Dilemma. I played that. That's not in my board game app. I've played the board game arena that I don't log. Some Steam games too. But yeah, so we're gonna talk about some games that taught us something. Before we get into that list, we're gonna go over 5 each. I just want to share a couple updates with Board Game with Education. That's the first thing is next week we'll have our kind of end of the year episode slash 2021 New Year episode. So we're gonna chat about 2020 and then look forward to this year and some plans for Board Game with Education. So that'll be next week. And then also every Friday, if you have Instagram, join me live on Fridays at 8:30 Pacific Standard Time. I chat live there on Instagram. I'm just learning how to use Instagram, so I'm still kind of figuring out the app. I know it's actually been growing a lot in the board game space. I've noticed a lot of content creators leveraging Instagram specifically. Usually it's traditionally like YouTube or I guess podcasts, but yeah, it's been cool to see some Instagram. Have you seen any Instagram board game media personalities in Facebook groups recently or elsewhere?
Oh, me personally, I don't know if it tied. I loosely follow stuff on there. I mean, I do have an account on it. I have a couple people, but that's generally not the way I follow people. I get a lot of my stuff through Twitter and through Facebook and stuff, and if it is, it's kind of through there. So
Right.
not as much. Maybe paying attention if they're on there or not. I mean, a lot of them do, and I generally don't go and look there unless I'm like super interested in a picture, something that they might have done there. But
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting to see the evolution of content creation through the social media channels because TikTok was really popular and people still kind of use TikTok, but then Instagram created they imitated TikTok with their Instagram reels, and now people are really using those to create their content on Instagram, and that's why I think there's a lot more content creators content creators on Instagram because of that new addition, the reels maybe.
Well, I think it's probably too that a lot of them were already on there.
Right,
So maybe it was an easy, shift or whatever. Instead of, doing this stuff with TikTok, is the only thing I can think of. Since
right.
I think some people, if you already got a platform you're already working from, it's just easy. Like, oh, they added this new way to create content. I'll just use the same thing. It makes it easier.
Right, right. Cool. Well, let's talk about our list. We're gonna do 5 each. I actually have multiple for a couple numbers.
Yeah, I could easily do that with some of mine too.
So, why don't we start with you? What was your first so this is in no particular order because these are the games that taught us something in 2020. So you can't really I guess you could maybe order what taught you something more, but I guess something is no matter how small is valuable here. So, what is the first one that you wanna talk about?
I'm going to use ecosystem. This actually came out in 2019, but it's just a little card drafting game where you're creating ecosystems. And I really liked, I guess what it taught me is, I mean, I understood this stuff already, but I just like the idea of how they, and it made me think too, how they put the cards together. Because you're creating like a little ecosystem environment, you're putting animals with certain environments, and I think they made everything, and even for me, made me think about it in a simple way. How, oh, that makes sense that this animal's in that environment. It would do this sort of thing mechanically in the game. So yeah, that's one of my it's not my number one, but it's in no particular. But that's one of my top games of this year.
Awesome. So that's Ecosystem and by Genius Games. That's
Yep.
actually on our website. You can check that out. And you've made some learning resources for that game too, which
Mm-hmm.
is really cool.
Yep.
And that's kind of my fifth one that I'll talk about. I want to I want to talk about my number five, but my first one is Food Chain Magnet. So I'm not an economics professor, and I'm not an expert on the economy or anything like that. But I've noticed some economic principles. I don't even know the names for them, but I've noticed I guess the theories, for example, in the game, you can price your items lower. And if your items are priced lower, the customers will go to you. But you get in this pricing war with someone else who will then in turn price their items lower. And then it just creates this very terrible market where it's no good for the businesses where everything's super cheap. You're maybe losing money. But that's one idea that I learned in the game or kind of saw that the game put into practice. Another one was the idea that you can corner the market and charge a lot for items. So it's really cool to see these actual economic principles in practice in the game. And it's a very much simulated as if this were how it were in the real world. So that's my number 2, Food Chain Magnet, and that's by Splatter Games. So how about your number 2?
Okay, my number two. This one's technically not out yet, so I can see this going on my list a couple of times, but it just had such a big impact for me this year. I mean, this has easily got to be one of the most anticipated games I've played. Even though if I'm thinking about board gaming with education, I'll try and throw some little tie-ins in it anyway. But the game is called Last Light. It's going to be published by Gray Fox Games. It's designed by Roy Cannaday of the Dice Tower. Um, it's a 4X style space game. Explore, expand, exploit, exterminate. If you don't know what that means. Um, but what is very interesting about it is that I think this is going to appeal to people that maybe generally don't like this type of game. I mean, I've done some play testing with it, and there's people that come in and are playing and go, I don't like these kind of games, but this resonates with me. I just really like it. It's got this simultaneous gameplay where there's just really no dead time. Everybody's doing, and it feels really epic, but it plays in a pretty short amount of time. It's just got this interesting dynamic. And I think what it's kind of taught me is, I think something this has kind of been my theme this year, is I'm starting to really get a sense, and I think most of us probably anyway, that I'm really starting to see what kind of games are really resonate for me, and that potentially from an education standpoint might be good, is that games that have really high player interaction. And there's a lot of stuff going on, there's not dead time, and I think that's kind of good if you're thinking about education stuff, that games that kind of have that are probably going to be good for students too, so that there's not any dead time. So yeah, I don't know, it's fantastic, and I can't wait till it hits Kickstarter and we get our hands on it, because it's really good.
Awesome, and that's Last Light. Who's the publisher?
It's Gray Fox Games.
Gray Fox Games. Awesome.
They're going to be doing it. A Kickstarter, I don't know exactly, but from what I understand, it's supposed to be sometime this year. So it might not be available until next year. It just depends how quick they can, produce it and all that sort of stuff. But it's really good.
Nice. So we're
So
starting with the hype train early.
yeah, exactly. I'm getting on that one, but it's really good.
Awesome. So my second one is actually two games, and you mentioned a 4X game. One of them is a 4X game called March of Ants, and the other one is Wingspan. So these are both, I guess, I don't know. I mean, biology based games, but not really. I mean, they're not designed as biology games, but they definitely incorporate different, I guess, wingspan birds and their interactions, and then March of Ants and other interactions. There's centipedes in the game as well as spiders, I think, too. Kinda reminds me of Sim Ant. I don't know if you're familiar with that game.
I
Um,
never played it, but yeah, I'm familiar with it.
yeah, I used to love Sim Ant. So, I chose these 2 games because Wingspan was the first one that I recognized that did this really well, and I didn't wanna leave that out. And it uses an example of real life mechanics in biology in the game. So, in Wingspan, there's several, but the one that really stood out to me and that's pretty prominent in the game and it's very noticeable is if you have a hawk in your card tableau or like as part of your I'm not sure what they call it exactly, but bird sanctuary or something in the game. If you have a hawk, you flip over a card off the top of the deck, and if the width of their wingspan is small enough, the hawk eats it and you earn a point. So that's something that actually, I mean, happens in the real world. And then March of Ants does something similar. Again, there's several examples, and each I guess the thorax, the abdomen, and the heads, they use that vocabulary as well as real life examples of different ants. There's there's one that I was talking to Tim Eisner, the designer and owner of the publishing company Weird City Games, and he talked about how there are ants that their heads explode, and he thought that was something really cool, and he had to include it in this game. So learning about those 2 things, and I had no idea that there are these types of ants where their heads explode. So that's something that I really actually learned this year and probably will never forget. So that's Wingspan by Stonemeyer Games and March of Ants by Weird City Games.
Cool.
How about your number 3?
My number 3 is another one that should be getting in our hands hopefully this month. It's After the Empire. This is another Gray Fox title. This is it's a worker placement tower defense, and it's got a historical component to it. It's kind of takes place in medieval Europe. And so basically you're managing like a little castle with, you have like fields and stuff for grow food on the outside. So you're managing it. And what's happening is these, hordes of invaders are coming in and attacking your castle. And so you have to build up your resources to defend your castle. I really like one of the things that really taught me, I thought was really neat. It was really nice to see somebody take kind of the theme and, at least in a historical sense, whether they realized or not, I've gotten a chance to play with one of the designers, and they said they hadn't thought about this, but they kind of incorporated those elements in, and it totally made sense. So when you lose resources in this game, a lot of games you get rid of them, and I like that this one lets you keep them. So like if you get a wall knocked down, you get to keep the resources from that wall so that you can like rebuild it, which means that, yeah, it got knocked down, but the stuff was still there and the people went and just gathered it up and, were able to, reuse that or whatever. I think once again, it's still playing into that thing for me with player interaction, or just this very interactive gameplay where there's lots of choices and you never get stuck. And this is one of those games where I found for a worker placement, sometimes, you go, I have nothing to do on my turn. Never the case with this one. As a matter of fact, this one's got the balance where you don't never have enough. It's always difficult. You got to make tough choices, every time. So, but that should be. I know it's hopefully starting to get distributed to backers. I mean, it was late from last year, understandably, but really good historical themed worker placement tower defense game from Gray Fox Games. After the Empire.
After the Empire. I was gonna say Age of Empires, but that's the video game. After the Empire. Awesome. And so my next one is gonna be Evolution. So this game came out, I want to say a while ago. I'm not sure the year exactly, but the digital based game came out this past year, think, or towards the end of 2019. And what did for sure 100% came out this year is the education version of the digital base game. And so I put this on my list because I was able to really kind of dive into this game and learn about the lesson planning for middle school age students and look at how ecosystems and the idea of how the ecosystem is always changing and looking at the game and how there are different moments in the game where food is very, very abundant. And so what happens is a lot of species develop within the game. And that's what happens in a real ecosystem. When there's more food, there's more species, there's more, I guess, animals that are around to eat the food. And then eventually, what people do in the game is they create a carnivore. So then they end up eating all the species, or what happens is they eat all the food and then the species die off. So I had a lot of fun looking at that and then kind of creating a lesson plan for it. And you can grab that lesson plan at evolutiondigitalgame.com/education. There's a link to their Google Drive. And also, we have Evolution the beginning in our store, and you were able to design some lessons for that. We'll eventually bring over some content for the base game too, but the lessons that you've designed are for the beginning, which is kind of a more streamlined approach to the base game.
Right. I think it's a good introduction to that one. If you haven't, I mean, just saying, I had personal experience with using that in my classroom. And I tried the regular evolution games, and some of my students struggled with that a little bit more. But then when I showed them the beginning, then it made sense. So then I was able to go back and then play evolution. And then the students are like, oh, okay. So sometimes that tends to work really well. Plus, it plays a little faster and that. But the basic concepts are still there. It's just, but it works well.
Yeah, it seems like there's two main things that are taken out of the base game. One was choosing which cards you
Right.
put in the middle.
Right.
And I can't remember the second part, but it kind of eliminates that extra layer of strategy, but still there's still some strategic decisions there. It's just more streamlined and less. It's a very much easier to introduce to people not familiar with the modern board game hobby, I'd say.
Sure. Sure. I think it's a better. I mean, even though that I don't think that game's too difficult to begin with, but yeah, if you're not really a gamer or you're not used to that sort of thing, I think the beginning one's a better starting off point for that if you wanted to show somebody that game and then play that one a little bit. And I think it would be really easy to transition into the regular base game that way.
It's also cheaper too. So if you're looking at introducing the idea of ecosystems and oh my gosh, I can't think of the word when animals die off.
Oh yeah, extinction
Extinction
and
and
you yeah, right.
uh that's not, oh man, that's part of it, but maybe it's a different one. I can't think of it. But anyways, it's cheaper. So it's a cheaper game. The base game's like 30 or $40. This game's like 20 or 25. So it's cheaper to kind of pick up too. Um all right, and how about your fourth one?
Okay, my fourth one is from Garphill Games / Renegade. It's Raiders of Scythia. This is kind of a historical themed game based off of the Raiders of the North Sea, which is a Viking themed. It incorporates a lot of mechanics from Raiders. So if you played Raiders of the North Sea, this one's going to be really easy to pick up. And it just basically works off this, once again, another worker placement game for me. I tend to kind of like those. Another thing I'm starting to learn that's one of my favorite mechanics. It's basically you put a worker down, take an action, and then pick up a different worker in a different spot, and then take that action. This one's kind of based in the Middle East and Asia. So you got like Persia and Greece and Assyria. It has some different factions and stuff like that, and they've incorporated some new mechanics. Where basically the Raiders of the North Sea had 2 expansions that they released with it, and they basically took and streamlined and incorporated it all into one game. And I really liked the way that it played, and it added a few new things and stuff like that. So even being a science teacher, I tend to like history themed games or civilization based games. So
Yeah, I like those type of games too. I mean, I played a lot of Civ on the computer game um, the last few years too. All right, so fourth, what was the publisher
yeah,
again?
it's Garphill Renegade. Yeah, Garphill Games, but I think you can really get it through Renegade Games now.
Okay, cool. And my fourth is Holly Festival of Colors. So I still have a lot to learn about this festival, but it was a nice introduction to what this festival is about. I knew of the festival already, but I had no idea kind of what it celebrated and what it meant and the idea behind the festival. And playing the game, I mean, I feel like in the rule book, like that's one of the first things you read is what the festival is about. And it's a way to celebrate the end of winter. And they spread color as a way of celebrating new beginnings. So to be able to play the game and just kind of learn the idea of this festival and be familiar with this culture was something that was nice to do. There's not a lot of outside of that, there's not a lot of other learning opportunities in the game. You kind of just have this introduction to what Holiday Festival Color is and what the idea of the festival is. But in the game, it's very much a area control game, puzzle game. It's not much a learning game per se. So it does. Do really enjoy this, and I love that games do kind of help you introduce you to new cultures and new ideas and other games similar to this. So that's Holly Festival of Colors, and I think that's gonna be Floodgate Games
Okay.
is
Oh,
the
I'm not
publisher.
even familiar with that one.
Yeah, it came out on Kickstarter early this year or early 2020. So we're in 2021 now, and I got it maybe about 2 months
Oh
ago.
wow. Okay.
So towards the end of the 2020. All right, how about your last one?
My last one kind of creeped in at the end. I don't know why. Always sometimes I like a lighter game will kind of grab my attention. But this one is Via Magica. Um, it is actually based on the game Augustus, and the designer is Paolo Mori, who's done several games I really like. He did a game last year called Blitzkrieg, little 2-player, 20-minute World War II game. Is really good. He's got another game called Gods of War that I really like. This one's a little different, though. It's kind of a magic based game. And once again, the stuff that I'm learning is I really like this simultaneous kind of gameplay where, there's not a lot of dead time. And you kind of have to think on your feet a little bit, which I tend to enjoy as well. You're basically trying to complete these portal cards, and why you're doing that is by collecting these resources that you're going to use to complete them. But the resources are drawn out of a bag, and everybody gets to use whatever comes out. So it's like air, water, fire, shadow, and earth. And so when that comes out, you get to put it on one of the cards. And I like you don't get stuck, because even if you've got all your spots taken, you can move them around. You could like shift something, doing it like another one comes out. Oh, and then it's just a race to complete 7 of these portals. But I don't know why. I mean, it's kind of simple, but it just, for me, it was fun. And I played it probably over a dozen times already. And I just started playing it like about a week or 2 ago. So it kind of creeped onto my list.
That's awesome. It snuck in
Yep. It snuck
2020
in.
for you.
Snuck in. Yep.
Just before the end. Awesome. So that's Via Magica and the publisher on that one?
Yeah. I think it's Olafante and Reflex Shop. There's 3 publishers that are involved in that one.
And my fifth one, all of the science-based games in our store. So for me, that was a big learning process, was developing and helping put those resources on our site and being able to see the resources that you've kind of created and going through that as a, I guess, quote unquote student, and kind of looking at it as a teacher and seeing what you had come up with and kind of looking at it as a editor, and that whole process of bringing it onto the site really taught me a lot, and even learning some little things within the games too, that you had asked some questions on some of the sheets. Like we played Nerd Ward Science at the beginning of the year. I remember learning some different science vocabulary. But yeah, so I would say all the science-based games that we have on our store has been a big learning opportunity for me personally, both as a, I guess, owner of Board Game with Education, and kind of bringing that together, and then also just learning little things about the science games too.
Right, right. Yeah, those are all really good. I think you're kind of really mentioning most of the genius stuff that we have.
Yeah, I
We
would
have some
say,
other stuff in there too, but a lot of the games we have are from them.
yeah, our science-based games are, it looks like the publishers we have are Genius Games, Looney Labs,
Right,
and North Star
right.
Games. And Element Poker too,
Mhm.
that's Engage Games. Um, but yeah, and then I guess, I mean, this is something we'll talk about next year, where we'll be moving into other content areas this year. Is ELA and ESL will be our next content area for designing resources, and we're always updating our resources. Like we had designed some resources for the science-based games, and then you actually went back and looked at some other ideas we could add to the game. So we added, for example, the Looney Labs, so the Flux games. We added create your own Flux game based off of, for example, chemistry Flux, and then looking at what kind of cards you can create to make your own game and have your students create their own game for chemistry Flux. Awesome. So those are our 5 games that we've learned something from this year. Do you have any, like, one kind of insight or one last thing you'd want to share about 2020 and the games you've played? Like, is there anything that kind of really stood out about any of the games you've played, or in general, the board game hobby?
Well, I think it's kind of been the challenge, I think, this year of trying to get some of those played, right? And that I I I think there's been once again, I think there's just been a lot of stuff that's come out that's really good, but it's just been that difficulty of kind of getting it to the table, unless you know I think a lot of those games have somehow found a way to port some way digitally, whether it went on Board Game Arena, and there's some other board game sites too that I'm actually on, but Tabletop Simulator or Tabletopia or something like that, so that you could kind of play it, or at least get a sense of it. But I think that's probably why um, some of the games probably might have more popularity, but it's just people that just haven't had a chance to play them. I know there's a couple right now that are really popular, that are really hard to get, even at the board game store I work at, and that's that Dune Imperium and Lost Legends of Arnak. I might have messed the name of that one up, but similar. They're both worker placement deck builders, but once again, just tough for people to play them and trying to get your hands on them. And I think that's the other thing, Dustin, too, just working at a board game store, at least seeing it from that standpoint, at least from a publishing standpoint, that it's been kind of difficult because things got slowed down, and distribution, and
Right.
sometimes we would get a hold of something and finally get it in, and then it just sells out, and then we having
Right.
problems getting more copies. I think it'll happen, but I think that's all obviously the pandemic really threw a wrench in a lot of that kind of thing, and it being really a socially interactive hobby, I think that's made it very challenging, and I think some people have had to resort to some interesting ways to do it. I mean, you got some people, I can't play digital games. I get it, but I do it because at least it gives me a little bit of that fix, and at least I'm having some interaction with people. But it doesn't replace in-person interactions you have with it by any means. But for now, I can do it. It's better than not playing at all. So
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's one thing, I guess a couple things you mentioned that, things that I can say that I learned from myself or learned this year is, one, I love board games and I love playing and meeting and hanging out online to play board games, but I don't think I'm the only one when I say this, that it's kind of draining sometimes when because it's a very
yep,
different
mm,
experience, that remote
right,
virtual experience. And I don't know. It's been easy for me to default to just playing video games instead because it's kind of designed for that experience. Um, but it depends on the game. Like I mentioned, King's Dilemma that has worked really well, and also Mothership, a role playing game. I think those kind of more off the
mm,
table games
right,
work really well in
sure,
a virtual environment. Um, but yeah, I think it's been hard for that. And then another thing you mentioned is like getting games. One thing that I'm still learning how to figure out is how to carry inventory and how much inventory of different games we should carry because you mentioned the distribution being tougher. And I mean, we have one game, Hanabi, that was really popular over the holidays and we sold out and we still have a couple customers who are waiting for copies and trying to figure out how to
hmm
find
right, right,
copies of the game, and this is new experience for me. So figuring out how to get games to customers that
hmm
are looking for them. Um, but yeah, that's something hopefully I'll figure
right,
out in the
right.
next couple
Well,
weeks.
I like I said, I think a lot of board game stores are going through the same thing. It's not like really exclusive to you and to the store I work for. I'm sure that's pretty common across the board. As far as that goes. And I mean,
Right.
kind of going back to you mentioning that the playing digitally can be draining. I totally agree with you. Um, and it's just whatever you like. But I, I just would hypothesize that I think people probably, if they're playing digitally, at least when I've done it with people or whatever, unless it's something you really enjoy and it's got some good digital implementation that um, kind of does some of the heavy lifting for you a little bit that's a little more difficult to do in a digital platform, that people are really gravitating to more quicker play games or ones where a lot of the stuff is kind of done for you. That's kind of what's nice about Board Game Arena. Or if you're on Tabletopia or Tabletop Simulator, if somebody's written a script, which basically they've done some of the like in between turn things, like it takes care of, you don't have to sort through all the pieces and reset the board and repass out cards or whatever it might be. If it's done like that, it's totally fine. And I like it. But I tended to like games that are a little bit shorter as well. When you're playing on the digital, it's just a little more draining, and stuff that might not have, so like I have to pick up and move so many different pieces. I think that can be daunting. And I think that's maybe have turned some people away too, because if you haven't played Tabletopia or Tabletop Simulator, that can be pretty daunting. And I know I did a couple of virtual conventions this year and helped run one, that the one that I have here, we did one online, and you know, teaching people that stuff and whatever. And I know it's tough, and you just got to be patient. And I mean, if you are, you can still have a fun experience, I think. But like I said, it's still not going to replace the in-person play.
Right. Right. All right. Well, I'm excited for next week because we're going to talk about 2020 and looking at 2021 for Board Game with Education. Roger, thank you again for sharing your top 5 games that taught you something.
Absolutely.
And if you're free on Fridays, you're listening to this, come join me on Instagram. I'm looking for more people to engage in our community there. So if you want to come say hi, I'm always curious what games you're playing. So that's a really easy way to come let me know what games you're playing. If I'm missing a game that might be good for our store, let Roger or I know. And Roger, where might someone reach out to you if they want to connect?
Well, I think probably just through I mean, the Facebook group I think works pretty well, but then the email to Roger at boardgamingwitheducation
Awesome.
.com works as well. So you can get me there on that email when I trying to remember to make sure that I go
Yeah,
check
yeah.
these
No,
things.
yeah. It's a
You
new
know,
email.
you know.
Yeah, and the Facebook group is game-based learning, Gamification in Games and Education is our Facebook group, or you can find it under our Facebook page, Board Game with Education. Then it'll be linked to our Facebook page too. Awesome.
Right.
So, as always, thank you for listening, and we'll be back next week.
Thank you for listening in this week. If you liked what you heard, be sure to let us know. You can find us on social media as Board Gaming with Education or BGE Games, or email us at podcast@boardgamingwitheducation.com. If you want to support our podcast, be sure to check out our support page on our website. As always, teach better, learn more, and most importantly, play more. Thank you for listening, and until next time.